this is a sort of a different sector. Not everybody handles it every day, and so there's some unique nuances that we want to make sure you're aware of. One thing for sure is that with nonprofits, there's a common misconception that it is a niche type segment, that it's small. Well, there's over 2.8 million not-for-profit entities in the United States. I mean, that's what we know of. It continues to grow year over year. It's very, very stable, and has done quite well even when there's been very bad economic times. As a matter of fact, during those poor economic times is typically when they're needed and when they respond to that community need. So that's something to keep in mind, that, working on nonprofit is a stable industry segment. It's not subject to things like restaurants, manufacturing might be. Additionally, most nonprofits tend to be small. About 66% of them have revenues less than $500,000. And while that's the case, they're still pretty complex and have some unique exposures. And the interesting thing about that is that I think you may, as you come into nonprofit accounts, and you may not immediately recognize them, is that they are probably placed somewhere where they don't belong. They may be written as like an office exposure, and there's severe limitations that they need to be concerned about, but we can help you address. So that's just something important to keep in mind. There's a lot that you can do to improve the coverage that they'll have. Current trends that we're seeing right now, there's definitely a resurgence in fundraising and event activities. So you figure most not-for-profits, they're not producing a product. They have to make their money somehow. So typically that's through campaigns and special events. And now we're seeing that increase across the board. And with that, there's even a greater need for insurance, because we're seeing more of the venues that they go to wanting to see that coverage in place. Additionally, now that we are in another sort of economic downturn, there's a greater need in the communities for the nonprofit services, things that aren't being provided elsewhere. Social connection, of course, is important now, but community resources, there's food and housing insecurity, and of course, there's more attention towards development of the youth and mentoring and STEM programs and all of that, stuff that I would say schools don't have the resources to provide. So the nonprofit sector is who's really answering that call. These next three items, I would say, are really what's also driving some pressures within insurance markets to reduce the offering that's out there. So for one, some of you may have heard of the Child Victims Act. That was something that was passed in about 2018 going into 2019. And what that successfully did was gave an opportunity or a look back window for individuals who suffered or were victims of abuse to now not be subject to those statutes of limitations in those specific states. So this, not that this is federal law, but many states adopted this Child Victims Act. And what that did was created a pretty significant tail for nonprofits and churches and the like that are operating. And probably the most egregious example of that would be Boy Scouts of America. At that time, the settlement fund for them grew to $2.7 billion because they had now thousands of claimants, because they were absolutely allowed now to bring action against them. So while that's an extreme example, it does show you that insurance companies paid attention and definitely got scared and said, maybe we shouldn't be as aggressive in writing this coverage line. And similarly, any funding organization started to realize this is an issue that they want to make sure a nonprofit has addressed before giving money. So that's one big thing that has changed the marketplace. There are less carriers now that are writing high limits of abuse and molestation. Social inflation, also nuclear verdicts have sort of changed the game. They've really increased the potential size of settlements. And what that has done is a lot, again, insurance markets look at that and say, we can't sustainably write very large limits, umbrella and excess for these organizations, and not just nonprofits. This affects all sorts of different companies and businesses. But with that, that has now reduced capacity. So you're seeing less often the ability to get higher limits. So just something to be aware of. And then, of course, the reverse is that nonprofits are really being required by a lot of different entities to have these different things in place. They want to see schools who are allowing nonprofits to use their space. They want to see very high limits in place. They want to see abuse and molestation in place. They want to see all these specialized coverages, contracts, funding sources, landlords. All of that has now created a much greater need, and we're seeing a much greater flow of business because of it. There are some upcoming trends that you should be aware of. First of all, with back to school, we see a lot of booster clubs, PTAs, and homeschool support and tutoring. All of that usually is working with the school, and they need to get coverage in place before the school year. Be aware for sports organizations, like I was just talking about that softball example, there was a carrier who stopped offering abuse and molestation for youth sports. CID and USLI, we can help. Institutional classes of business. Another carrier has recently sent non-renewals to all of those risks, churches, museums, arts, and theaters. We can help. And finally, umbrella. We can easily offer excess limits, whether it's over ourselves or another carrier.